Hey everyone, this is a review by Paul Mattick of Marx Before Marxism by David McLellan. The review was published in Science and Society, Volume 35, Number 3, in fall 1971. McLellan's book was published in 1970. Here is another addition to the vast literature devoted to the young Marx and his relationship to the mature Marx of Capital, a subject which has agitated academic Marxism during the last decade. McLellan offers as justification for his book the claim that previous interpretations of Marx's early writings suffered from one or another bias, whereas his own exposition is presented as, quote, neutrally as possible, end quote. McLellan presents these writings, quote, in their historical context, end quote, which has of course been extensively dealt with by other authors as well, and which does not release McLellan from answering the question of whether there is a decisive difference between the young and the old Marx. McLellan concludes in the end that there is no difference because Marx remained a Hegelian throughout his life, as demonstrated by his Grundrisse der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie. McLellan offers us once more the social and cultural conditions under which Marx grew up, his family relations, and his early intellectual pursuits, particularly his conversion to Hegelianism. From this conversion, and with the aid of Feuerbach, Marx soon turned into a critic of Hegelian philosophy, a process which began with the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, the contribution to the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbuch, and the German ideology. After the last named work, Marx shifted his interest from philosophy to political economy, as dictated by his historical materialism, which had grown out of his criticism of both Feuerbach and Hegel, and out of his own observations of social reality. This shift from philosophy to the critique of political economy has strangely been interpreted as a sacrifice of the humanism that characterized Marx's early writings, in which he concerned himself with the nature of man as such, with man's self-alienation and the requirements for recovering his human essence. This concern soon made room for the consideration of historical class-determined men, the exploitation of labor by capital, and the proletarian revolution. Marx's philosophical humanism became practical humanism to be realized in a classless, non-exploitative society. In this sense, there is, of course, continuity between the young and the old Marx, in that the old Marx was able to express clearly and concretely what the young Marx had set forth vaguely and abstractly. The choice between the young and the old Marx is thus an impossible choice, even though Marx's later writings are clearly preferable to his early writings. In recent years, the emphasis has nonetheless been on Marx's early writings, not on his scientific analysis of capitalist society. McLellan assumes that this is due to the fact that some of Marx's economic and political predictions had lost their validity through the, quote, progressive integration of the working class into the social order, end quote. McLellan. Still, people remained unhappy, and attempts to explain their dissatisfaction led to a return to the unsolved problem of man's alienation. The gap between ideology and reality in Eastern Europe, too, showed that the humanist side of Marxism had been neglected, and that a return to Marx's early concerns might be a way to improve conditions in the socialist states. What appears as essential in this explanation is a change in the attitudes of men as a precondition to a betterment of their social conditions. And the new concern with man's alienation in existing societal forms thus reflects the present inability or unwillingness to alter these forms. It is a return to an idealist position, precisely to the position of the early Marx still engaged in the process of freeing himself from Hegelianism. But the answer to this trend must be derived from the Marxism of Marx, not from the Marx before Marxism. This leads to the question of the relation between Marx and Hegel, and here, according to McLellan, quote, Marx always remained in some sense a Hegelian, end quote. McLellan. The question is only in what sense. McLellan points to Lenin's remark that, quote, it is impossible to fully grasp Marx's Capital, and especially the first chapter, if you have not studied or understood the whole of Hegel's logic, end quote. McLellan also cites Hegelian terminology employed by Marx in the Grundrisse der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie. In a recent article in the magazine Encounter, David McLellan describes the Grundrisse as the newly discovered, quote, missing link, which restored continuity and inner harmony between the writings of the early and the late Marx. In this connection, he finds it particularly, quote, noteworthy that ... throughout the Grundrisse, the agent of transformation, the revolutionary activity of the proletariat, is never alluded to, end quote. McLellan. The Grundrisse are exactly what their name implies, a first attempt, Rohentwerf, in preparation for the contemplated capital. They were not considered ready for publication, but were the product of 15 years of study and self-clarification, and therefore did not need to contain the obvious, such as alluding to the proletariat as the agent of social change, which had already been established 10 years earlier in the Communist Manifesto. For McLellan, however, the Grundrisse is Marx's, quote, basic work, of which the critique of political economy and capital are, quote, only partial elaborations, end quote, because in the Grundrisse, quote, the Hegelian categories in which Marx forms his thought are obvious, end quote. McLellan, and because, quote, questions that were prominent in Marx's 1844 writings, such as the nature of labor and the resolution of the conflict between the individual and the community, are taken up again and filled out with a wealth of detail, end quote. McLellan. Marxism does not, however, concern itself so much with the true nature of labor and relations between the individual and the community, as quite specifically with the nature of wage labor and the relations between labor and capital. Although Hegel's philosophy formed Marx's starting point, Marx soon realized that the idealistic dialectic was a mystification of the actual dialectical process of social development. It was not Hegel's philosophy which led Marx to an understanding of capitalist society, but the relatively independent understanding of capitalist society which made him recognize the, quote, rational kernel contained in the mystical shell of Hegelian philosophy. In this sense, he remained a Hegelian. That is, he understood that Marx expressed in an ideological philosophical form. In this limited sense, Marx remained a Hegelian. That is, Marx understood that Hegel expressed in an ideological philosophical form an actually occurring process which found its concrete expression in the political economy of capitalism. Marx's dialectic is thus to be found in Capital, not in the philosophical writings, even though he could use Hegelian categories interchangeably with those of political economy, as was the case in the Grundrisse. McLellan himself points out that Hegel's philosophy emerged out of the ideas of the French Revolution, the writings of the English economists, the growth of industry, and the economic war of all against all, yet it turned an actual historical development into an absolute philosophical system, in which the former lost its practical meaning and therefore its revolutionary nature. If it is true, as McLellan says, that Marx's, quote, early writings contain all the subsequent themes of Marx's thought and show them in the making, end quote, it is also true that the progress made by Marx from his early philosophical writings, via the Grundrisse to Capital, commits present-day Marxism, as it committed Marx, to stress not his philosophical starting point, but the underlying capitalist production relations in their capitalist appearance as economic categories. The end. Paul Mattick. Thanks for listening.